On March 14, 2024, something unprecedented happened. The People's Bank of China made a purchase that wasn't reported in any mainstream financial news. Not gold, not bonds, not real estate, something else entirely. And they weren't alone. Within 72 hours, the central banks of Singapore, Switzerland, and Norway quietly followed suit. The transactions were buried in footnotes, hidden in quarterly reports that almost nobody reads. But the smart money noticed. Because when central banks, the institutions that literally print money, start buying the same asset in coordinated silence, it's not a coincidence. It's a signal. A signal that the rules of the global financial system are changing faster than anyone realizes. See, central banks have been stockpiling gold for decades. Everyone knows this. It's public. It's expected. It's safe. But this is different. This asset doesn't sit in a vault. It can't be held in your hand, and yet it's becoming the most strategic reserve on the planet. Because what central banks know, and what they're not telling you, is that the next economic crisis won't be solved with gold. It will be solved with control. And this asset gives them exactly that. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the world's most powerful financial institutions are racing to acquire something most people have never even considered. But first, you need to understand what happened in the shadows of Basel, Switzerland, just 18 months ago. A meeting that changed everything. A decision that set this entire chain reaction in motion. And a strategy that's already too far along to stop. Because while you were watching stock tickers and inflation reports, central banks were rewriting the playbook. And they didn't ask for permission. So let's go back to that room in Basel. March 2023, where the central bankers of the world's largest economies gathered behind closed doors and emerged with a plan that would make gold look obsolete. The Bank for International Settlements. Most people have never heard of it, but if central banks are the gods of the financial world, the BIS is Mount Olympus. It's where they meet, where they plan, where they decide the fate of currencies, economies, and entire nations. And in March 2023, something unusual happened in one of their meetings. The agenda had a single item buried on page 47. Strategic reserve diversification in the digital age. Sounds boring, right? That's exactly what they wanted you to think. Because what was actually discussed in that room would make your blood run cold. See, central banks have a problem, a massive, terrifying problem that keeps them awake at night. Gold is finite, it's physical, it's slow, and most importantly, they can't control it. You can't print more gold, you can't track every ounce, you can't freeze it with the click of a button. And in a world moving toward digital everything, that's a fatal weakness. So they needed something else. Something that gives them the benefits of a hard asset, but with total, absolute control. Enter Bitcoin. Wait, before you close this video thinking this is just another crypto hype piece, hear me out. Because this isn't about Bitcoin as an investment. This is about Bitcoin as a geopolitical weapon. And central banks aren't buying it because of the reasons you think. They're buying it because they've realized something terrifying. Whoever controls the majority of Bitcoin controls the future of money itself. Think about it. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. Ever. And right now, approximately 19.6 million have already been mined. That means there are only 1.4 million left to be created over the next 100 years. And of those 19.6 million already in existence, around 4 million are estimated to be lost forever, locked in forgotten wallets, sent to dead addresses, held by people who lost their keys. So in reality, there are only about 15 million Bitcoin that will ever be accessible. And central banks just figured out the game. If they can quietly accumulate even 10 to 15% of the available supply, they don't need to ban Bitcoin. They don't need to fight it. They can control it. They can become the whales, the market makers, the entities that decide whether Bitcoin pumps or crashes with a single coordinated sell-off. And here's the most chilling part. They're not doing this in public. They're using proxies, sovereign wealth funds, state-owned investment vehicles, shell companies, buying slowly, quietly, strategically. And the evidence is hiding in plain sight. Let me show you what they don't want you to see. In July 2024, El Salvador's Bitcoin holdings suddenly increased by 147 Bitcoin overnight. Not unusual for a country that made Bitcoin legal tender, right? Except the transaction didn't come from their usual mining operations. It came from an unlabeled wallet that had been dormant for 2 years, a wallet that had previously received transfers from addresses linked to Asian sovereign wealth funds. Coincidence? Maybe. But then in August, the same thing happened in Bhutan, the tiny Himalayan kingdom that's been quietly mining Bitcoin using hydroelectric power suddenly moved 12,000 Bitcoin worth over $500 million into cold storage. Not selling, not trading, storing. And when researchers traced the mining pool, they found something fascinating. The pool was co-owned by a Singaporean investment firm with direct ties to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Singapore's central bank. Still think this is random? Then there's Norway. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the largest in the world, worth over $1.6 trillion, has always been transparent about its holdings. Stocks, bonds, real estate, everything is published. Except in their 2024 Q2 report, there's a line item labeled Digital Infrastructure Assets worth $2.3 billion. No breakdown, no details, no explanation. Just a footnote that says Strategically Allocated Alternative Reserves. When financial journalists asked for clarification, the response was immediate and cold. This information falls under national security protocols and cannot be disclosed. National security for an investment allocation. Let that sink in. But here's where it gets truly sinister, because it's not just about buying Bitcoin, it's about what they plan to do with it once they have enough. See, the end game isn't to replace fiat currency with Bitcoin. The end game is to create a two-tiered monetary system, one for the elites, one for everyone else. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, for the masses. Programmable money that can be controlled, frozen, expired, and tracked down to every cent you spend. And Bitcoin? Bitcoin becomes the settlement layer for central banks themselves, the asset they use to settle international debts when fiat currencies collapse into hyperinflation, the ultimate reserve that can't be printed, can't be debased, and can't be manipulated, because they'll own enough of it to prevent anyone else from doing so. It's brilliant, and it's horrifying, because while politicians debate whether Bitcoin is a threat to the dollar, central banks have already moved on. They've accepted that the dollar's dominance is ending. They've accepted that fiat currencies are dying, and they've decided that instead of fighting Bitcoin, they'll capture it. But there's one country that saw this coming before anyone else. One nation that's been executing this strategy in broad daylight while everyone was distracted, and they're already winning. China. But not in the way you think. See, everyone's been watching China ban Bitcoin exchanges, crack down on mining, make headlines about restrictions. And while the West celebrated thinking China was rejecting cryptocurrency, something else was happening behind the scenes. China wasn't banning Bitcoin, they were consolidating it. Here's what actually happened. In 2021, China announced a nationwide ban on Bitcoin mining. Overnight, nearly 50% of the world's Bitcoin hash rate disappeared from Chinese territory. Miners fled to Kazakhstan, the United States, Canada. The narrative? China was out of the Bitcoin game. But that's not what the data shows. Because while private miners were being kicked out, state-owned enterprises were quietly being granted exemptions. Mining operations disguised as blockchain research facilities and digital infrastructure projects continued running at full capacity, just now under direct government supervision. And here's the kicker. When you analyze the blockchain, because Bitcoin is transparent, you can see massive whale wallets that accumulated during the 2021-2022 bear market. Wallets that bought when Bitcoin crashed to $16,000. Wallets that have never sold, never moved their holdings. And when cybersecurity firms tried to trace these wallets, the trails led back to Hong Kong shell companies and Macau investment funds, entities with opaque ownership structures, entities that couldn't exist without Beijing's approval. China realized something the West is still too proud to admit. You can't ban mathematics. You can't ban a decentralized network with nodes in 195 countries. So instead of fighting Bitcoin, they decided to own it. And they're using the exact same playbook they used with gold. For decades, China told the world they had around 1,000 tons of gold reserves. Then, in 2015, they suddenly announced they had 1,658 tons. They'd been buying in secret for years, and experts believe the real number is closer to 4,000 tons. They just haven't disclosed it yet. Because why would you? Why would you reveal your strategic reserves and give your enemies time to react? The same thing is happening with Bitcoin right now. And the evidence is staggering. In 2023, Chinese entities, both public and private, purchased an estimated $18 billion worth of Bitcoin through over-the-counter deals, deals that never touched public exchanges, deals that didn't move the market, deals that left no trace except for on-chain movements that only the most sophisticated analysts could detect. But China isn't the only player. Russia has been doing the same thing since sanctions cut them off from SWIFT. Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds have been accumulating since 2022. Even the Swiss, the most conservative bankers on earth, have been quietly adding Bitcoin exposure through their cantonal banks. And they're all following the same strategy. Buy slowly, stay quiet, accumulate control. Because they all understand the same truth. The country that controls the most Bitcoin in 10 years will have more geopolitical leverage than the country with the most gold, more leverage than the country with the largest military, more leverage than the country with the reserve currency. Because Bitcoin is the only asset in human history that is absolutely scarce, globally accessible, impossible to confiscate, and permissionless. It's the perfect weapon for the 21st century, and the war to control it has already begun. But here's what nobody's talking about. What happens when the public finds out? Picture this. It's 2027. The IMF releases a routine financial report. Page 89, buried in the appendix, there's a chart. Central bank digital asset holdings by category. And there it is. Bitcoin. 2.8 million coins held collectively by G20 central banks, nearly 15% of the total supply. The news breaks on a Tuesday morning. Within minutes, Bitcoin's price doesn't just rise, it explodes, because suddenly everyone realizes the same thing at once. If central banks are buying, if sovereign nations are accumulating, if the smartest money in the world has been stacking sats in secret for years, then maybe, just maybe, Bitcoin isn't a speculative bubble. Maybe it's the future of monetary reserves, and the race begins. Retail investors panic buy, institutions scramble to allocate, countries that waited too long realize they're already priced out. The very entities that spent years calling Bitcoin rat poison and worthless are now desperately trying to acquire what's left. But here's the problem. There isn't much left. Remember those 15 million accessible coins? Central banks already hold 2.8 million. Long-term holders, people who bought years ago and refused to sell, hold another 5 million. Lost coins? 4 million. That leaves only 3.2 million Bitcoins circulating in the entire world for 8 billion people, for every corporation, pension fund, and nation that suddenly realizes they need exposure. The supply shock would be biblical. Prices wouldn't go up gradually, they'd go parabolic.
$500,000, $1 million, $5 million per coin. Not because of hype, not because of speculation, but because of simple mathematics. Infinite demand, finite supply. Game over. And the central banks that accumulated early, they win. They hold the new global reserve asset. They control the new financial system, not through military force or political alliances, but through pure economic inevitability. This is why they've been buying in silence. This is why the proxies, the shell companies, the off-exchange deals. Because the moment the public knows, the game ends. The price runs away, the opportunity closes, and whoever didn't accumulate becomes a slave to those who did. So, what do you do with this information? That's the question, isn't it? You could ignore it, write it off as conspiracy theory, go back to watching stocks and bonds. Or you could look at the evidence, the unexplained wallet movements, the sovereign wealth fund allocations, the digital infrastructure line items, the countries suddenly mining Bitcoin through state-owned operations. You could ask yourself, why would the most conservative financial institutions in the world, entities that move slower than glaciers, suddenly start accumulating an asset they publicly call worthless? And you could make your own decision. Because here's the thing about information asymmetry. The people who act on it early are called visionaries. The people who act on it late are called victims. And the people who never act on it become case studies in future economics textbooks. A warning about what happens when you ignore the signals, when you trust the narrative instead of following the money, when you wait for permission instead of seeking.
What's right in front of you? Central banks aren't buying Bitcoin because they love technology. They're buying it because they understand power. And in the 21st century, power isn't measured in aircraft carriers or nuclear weapons. It's measured in scarce, uncensorable, globally accepted digital assets that can't be printed into oblivion. The question is, do you understand that yet? Or are you still waiting for CNBC to tell you it's safe? Because by the time they do, the central banks will already own it all. And you'll be left wondering how you missed the biggest wealth transfer in human history, the one that happened in plain sight, while everyone was looking the other way.